And so tonight, tonight we're going to be talking about the Siddur, about the prayers, as a system, as a entity, as a text. Because last week we talked about how Jews pray and moved from the temple to synagogue. Something happened last week which was not good, which is that I somehow did not record it properly. Well, in the sense that it didn't record at all. Though, in a weird thing, I have a transcript of it. So I wound up with a transcript of it so I can maybe like read it back. But no, I'm really upset because it was a really good class. We talked about a lot of important history and it's gone. It's evaporated. And so far all the other classes, this is now the 12th class we've had in the Jewish Journeys cycle, and everything's been recorded except for this last week. So I'm going to do it this week. I mean, I already started recording it, and I need to make sure we go on Facebook. So I'm going to do that too right now so that I can get everybody on Facebook with us. But yeah, I didn't record it I didn't stream it on Facebook. I don't know what happened last week, but I think we're having some technical difficulty. We were? You sure? Well, I couldn't get it off of Facebook. Oh, maybe I'll try again. Anyways, yeah, I don't think it was. I didn't see it. So I'm very upset, apologetic about the fact that it didn't work last week. But yeah, um, we'll make sure that I'll try to make sure that that doesn't happen again.
Gosh, that's the one class I wanted to go back and watch too.
Stop it. What a pain. I think what one of the things that I hoped I we got across last week was that look, it was a major thing to go from a temple where people sacrificed to a system of prayers where people, you know, offer up prayers that kind of take the place of sacrifice. But today I was going to tell you a little bit how that happened from the standpoint of like, what's the mentality of the prayers? Because last week kind of said it, but today we're going to kind of show how it happened from the standpoint of like, okay, well, functionally, how did the prayers replace that? Like, how did prayers replace sacrifice? And as we made a point, the prayers started before there was while the temple was still there. So it's not like the temple was destroyed and everybody ran around going, "We got to find us. We have to find some system that'll take its place." It wasn't like that. The system already existed. It's just now that became the way. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. How that happened from the standpoint of like, okay, well, what did it look like? And so that's what we're going to do today. So I made this really cool chart. Now it looks really nice. I think it looks nice. It's a lot more colorful than things I normally do. That was done with AI. I had to do this by hand. So this was partly done by AI. But yeah, this colorful chart had to be done. I had to cut and paste. But it was cool. It at least gave me like kind of a way of framing it. So we're going to take a look at it. Actually, I'll put it on here now, the colorful pictures. So we're going to talk about the service and, of course, the Siddur. So the Siddur, our prayer book, is the text that takes us through our prayers. And it's a foundational text of Judaism in the sense that we talked already about the Torah and the Tanakh, what the difference is, the Torah scroll versus, again, the whole Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. But we also have, of course, the Talmud. And we talked about rabbinic texts, and not just the Talmud, but also the Midrash and other collections, though the Talmud is really a collection. And it's a, the text itself is pivotal and important. We also talked about other Jewish texts in Jewish law, halakha, that became part of books and texts that were foundational that people had to read and had to study. But the Siddur is one of those as well. And the Siddur, as I mentioned last week, we start to see a Siddur develop in the period right around the time the Talmud was completed. in the what we call the Gaonic period, and it was done primarily in Babylonia. The first Siddurim were assembled there. The prayers go back to things that are in the Torah and in the Bible, but the actual prayer books that we have, the oldest prayer books from the Gaonic period, and one of the oldest prayer books, somebody actually pointed this out last week, was found in Afghanistan. The oldest prayer books that we have are from about the 850s, but we know that they're referred to and they're copies and pieces of texts that that go back to that period. So let's say 700s, 800s. So the text itself is important, especially when we find an old text, because we can say, well, what prayers are here? What prayers are in the prayer book? And one of the things that we're going to obviously kind of talk about today is the fact that our prayer book is like a archaeological tell. One of the things that, again, the archaeological mounds that we have in Israel, where you see layers and layers and layers. And that's what the prayer book is. It's the accretion of thousands of years, 2,000 years of prayers that have been added over time. For the most part, not a lot has been taken out. So the prayer book that we have today in Orthodox and conservative and Reform synagogues is much larger than the books we had 1,000 years ago. Okay, so we've added and we really don't take away. What is there though, and what we actually relied on, of course, are texts from the Bible. And the first things that we find in the Siddurim, and the kind of the building block, if you will, of the Siddur, is are the lines from Torah, and of course the most famous is the Shema. The Shema comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6, and that's literally lifted right out. There's also, of course, the Song of the Sea, Michamocha, which comes right out of Exodus chapter 15, and there's a lot of psalms that are added to the Siddur, and those from the book of Psalms. There's a lot that just we do the whole thing, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But we also have prayers that develop over time that developed really early, which are texts that we find in the Mishnah itself, in the Talmud, the earliest parts of the Talmud. And those are formula prayers that begin with the phrase, Baruch atah Adonai, blessed are you, God. Now, we kind of had that phrase in the Torah, but really as a formula with Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, that formula, we start to see it in the Talmud. And those blessings are another huge building block of the Siddur. And as we start to see the service develop, it develops around this key idea that we're supposed to pray 3 times a day. Now, that whole concept of praying 3 times a day develops from the original idea, that there were 3 times a day when the priests offered sacrifices. Roughly, again, a morning at dawn, a mincha an afternoon or a later offering, and then a mariv and a sundown offering. The Bible tells us that these sacrifices were offered 3 times a day. And so the prayer service started before even the temple was destroyed with a prayer service around those sacrificial times. And so you have the biblical texts, but you also have this kind of reflection of biblical behavior through praying at the times of the sacrifices. You also have, of course, blessings that are added to the Siddur. And then, of course, more importantly, like, doesn't have to be in the Siddur, over food and over rituals, lighting Shabbat candles, things like that, lighting Hanukkah candles, that develop over time, and they follow a formula which begins, of course, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Now, we might discuss this in a whole separate class, but let's just say for right now that one of the most important things to remember about that formula that you hear all the time is that we have two variations of that formula. The Siddur has both. And the things that we say blessings over without a Siddur have both. And by that, I'm going to tell you that you may or may not have noticed before. We have one form of a prayer, of a bracha that begins, and a bracha literally is a bracha, something that begins with Baruch atah Adonai, a blessing. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam. And then we say something like Borei Pri Hagafen or Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz. We are saying thank you to God for something that we're about to enjoy, something we're going to eat, something we're going to smell even. When we smell the spices, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, Borei Minei V'samim, for the many spices that we can smell. So that is a blessing over something that we enjoy or that's something we see. By the way, we see it, say a blessing over seeing a rainbow. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam zocher habrit. Thank you, God, for remembering the covenant. So those are things that we say over things that we enjoy. Those are brachot that you know. But we also have blessings over actions, over doing things. And when we say a blessing over doing something, like washing our hands or lighting candles, we add the phrase to Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, and then we say Asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav vetzivanu, and then we'll say whatever it is. Lahadlik ner shel Shabbat, lahadlik ner shel Hanukkah, for lighting the candles of Shabbos, for lighting the candles of Hanukkah, we say Lihitatef batzitzit, for wrapping us in tzitzit. Whenever we do a physical action, we add the phrase Asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav vetzivanu. We thank you, God, for the mitzvah and for this act of for performing the mitzvah. You've made us holy. Asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav. You've made us holy through these actions. And so that's the added part for doing an action. So we have the first part that goes through Eloheinu melech haolam, which is thanking God, and then either for something or for an action. And those, of course, are the building blocks for our tefillot, for our prayers, both for the prayers of things that we enjoy in food, which are really not the prayers of the Siddur, because most of the prayers of the Siddur, I mean, there's very few that you'll see in the Siddur where you actually then eat something. The one of the few that you'll find in a Siddur, for example, and again, a Siddur today oftentimes will have a hamotzi or a kiddush so that people who are sitting in synagogue can say it, but many of them don't. It's not in ours. It's not in most, but there oftentimes will be a kiddush only because a kiddush is done traditionally during Havdalah, and their Havdalah blessings are in the Siddur for Saturday evening. It's traditionally done after the Amidah if you're doing an evening service. We're going to talk about the fixed times, though. But the blessings are really important. The brachot formula is really important. Anyone has any questions, please jump in. Ask. Don't be afraid to interrupt. So we have these building blocks that already exist or exist by the time the temple is destroyed, of lines from the Torah that we say, brachot, blessings that we say. And then also, before the temple is even destroyed, we have the prayer that we call the Amidah. The Amidah is called by three names, the same prayer. The Amidah means the standing prayer. The prayer is also called Hatfilah, which means the prayer. And the other prayer, the other name we have for the prayer is the Shmona Esrei, the 18, which is weird because there's actually 19 prayers for the Shmona Esrei, but that's during the week. Most people are familiar with the Amidah from Shabbat, when there's only 7 blessings. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But the Amidah becomes a fixed part of the service even before the temple is destroyed. But once the temple gets destroyed, once the temple is destroyed during the Roman period, in 70 of the Common Era, the Amidah becomes, and it was the rabbis who decided this, the Amidah becomes the prayer that we do instead of the sacrifice. So every place that we had a sacrifice, the rabbis will say, there, where the sacrifice was, Shachri, Mincha, and Mariv, morning, afternoon, and evening. An extra one we call Musaf on Shabbos. An extra one on holiday. We'll put an Amidah every time there was a sacrifice. And so the Amidah becomes the placeholder for where the sacrifice was. But they did it with a prayer that they already had. They just knew it was such an important prayer, it was such a focal point of the service, that that was going to be where the sacrifice was. And the sacrifice was what people came to the temple for. And the Amidah was going to take its place because that was going to be the point in time where we get to business. And I'll explain that when we look at the service um, in more detail. Now, we also have prayers that would come after that, which we'll look at in a moment. But as time goes on, people start adding prayers to the Siddur that have to do, for example, with Shabbat. We develop a whole service, a little service, tiny service, but it's a little special service called Kabbalat Shabbat, welcoming Shabbat. And there's things like Lechadodi and Psalms that we do during that. You know one section really well that we do. It's the part that we do at the high holidays. Now, most people who only come for high holidays think that high holiday service has these things that we do once a year. Well, we do, some of them, but most of the service on high holidays is a morning service. Most of the service is familiar if you're in a morning service because the building blocks of it are the parts we do every day. And I'll usually point out at high holidays, this is a part of the service that isn't a daily prayer or a Shabbat prayer. The other part of the service that was added was the Torah service, which is only done in the morning service. The only time we ever take the Torah out at night is for Kol Nidre. We take out the Torah scrolls just to have them in our presence. But of course, in Simchat Torah, when we read the Torah, we start the Torah again. But other than that, the only time we ever take out the Torah and the only time we take it out to read, except for Simchat Torah, is in the mornings. And those mornings would be Monday, Thursday, and Saturday. Monday and Thursday, because those were market days. Those were days that people were in town. And the rabbi said, those are the days that we're going to read the Torah. And that was in existence even before the temple was destroyed. The rabbis had already determined, and it seems like it was even before there were even people we'd call rabbis, that people would study Torah and hear the Torah being read in public on market days. Again, before there were rabbis, yeah, I mean, according to the book of Ezra, they took out the Torah and read it to the people and said, we're going to read this Torah as much as we can, especially when we have everybody together. The rabbi said, we're going to have a time in the morning service where we'll read the Torah. So, well, so Esther said, does doing it on Shabbat make it more important? Shabbat, I think the understanding of doing it on Shabbat was that, look, on Shabbat, there's no question that we have the time to do it, because we're not supposed to be doing anything other than reading and praying, being with family and friends. But the idea of doing it on Monday and Thursday was these are the days that people are going to come to town. These are the days that they're doing their shopping. They're doing their selling. So if a guy was a butcher and he had his products, or he was I say he because the people who were coming to the Torah service were guys, they would come to do their business, and they would do the service usually before they went to the market, but they would come with their stuff and they would do a service in the morning. On Mondays and Thursdays, they would read the Torah because they were there. There was a service going on there the other days. It's just on Mondays and Thursdays, more people were there. Now, here's the weird thing. When people in the Jewish community were more observant, that's when they would traditionally, when you can maybe even have heard these stories from your parents or grandparents, when somebody had a bar mitzvah in the 1930s, and I say a bar mitzvah because there were no bat mitzvahs yet, they would usually have them on a Monday or Thursday. Yeah. Yeah. So Esther just said her father went to the bar mitzvah to get bar mitzvah, and his grandfather wasn't even there on a Thursday. Yeah, it was on a Thursday, and that's what people did. It was not. It was not. I mean, there was people who celebrated that fact, but it was no party. There was no. There was maybe a gift, but the fact that somebody had read from the Torah that day was because it was the closest day to their birthday, that Monday or Thursday, and that was the day they read Torah. So, I mean, if their birthday was on Tuesday, they'd read it on Thursday at 2 days later, and they said, "Oh, this is the closest day." They didn't do it on Monday because his birthday was on Tuesday or Wednesday. They just did it when the closest day when the kid was already had turned 13. And that's what they did. So they didn't wait for Shabbat. Now, again, if the kid was birthday on Friday, then maybe they would have the bar mitzvah on Saturday, but it was not a big deal. They didn't, they just said, okay, the kid comes up and does a blessing and maybe he reads it if he knows it, and that's it. If he can read the text, wonderful. So people started the Torah service would be there in the morning and people could do it and then they would go home and that was their day. They got to read the Torah. Later on, of course, we didn't stop. Like after the Middle Ages, they didn't stop writing prayers. Continue to write prayers. Actually, some of the more famous prayers come from the later Middle Ages for high holidays. The weekly service, pretty much what we had 1,000 years ago. But there's other prayers, especially ones for high holidays and also for Shabbat, like Lecha Dodi was written in the 1500s. Things keep getting added, but not a lot. And then, of course, in today's world, we continue to write prayers because in 1948, most synagogues around the world added a prayer for Israel. People started praying for their own government. They prayed, said they have a prayer for the United States. They started in the 1700s. They started praying for the United States. In England, I've said this before. They have a prayer. They had a prayer for my whole life for the Queen of England. And I went to services a couple years ago for the first time, and he changed it to the King. I'm like, oh yeah, can't pray for her anymore. But my whole life, they were praying for the Queen, and then all of a sudden, they're praying for the King. So they did that. And of course, other synagogues have added readings and have added prayers that are reflective of our own days and our own concerns. And we've added prayers around Yom HaShoah, around the Holocaust. And so people have done that. And of course, we've changed the prayers. We've made them more gender, inclusive. We've changed the things from only male words to 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 non-gendered words, which is one of the things that I tried to do in the Siddur that I created for the synagogue was to take out every time it was possible to take out the gendered language. Look, there's people who don't even like the fact that the gendered language is the gendered language, just not saying he or she is not enough. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that very end. We'll get to that, I promise. But these are all concerns that and things that we saw added. But we'll talk about like at the end. I want to get to like so what's different today, or what are the concerns that we have today? We talked a little bit about it last week, but we'll maybe talk about it a little bit more today, because from the terms of not just like what is a service or how often do we go to service, but um, and I don't even like to use the word service anymore. I really don't like to use the word service. I like to use celebration or, Shabbat experience. I think service sounds hard. It sounds not fun. And I think service, I mean, I get it, we're serving God or whatever, but I think it's also a celebration, right? It's a celebration of God, of community, of our traditions. And so I like the word celebration more. For the purposes of today, I'm going to use a little bit more practical, maybe, and a little bit more traditional language for what we're doing. But yeah, I try not to use that. I try not to use the word service. Um, it doesn't seem to convey also again what I think people hopefully are coming for. But whatever. It's a more modern idea for me, maybe.
Hey, Rabbi,
Well, yes.
What can you just restate when did like the formal services start happening
So
where people
so
would go?
a formal service goes back before the temple was destroyed. There's a formal service. And
But you had to
again,
go to
we
you had to go to the temple. You couldn't. There weren't local
no, there were
shuls.
synagogues already. We said last week there are synagogues that predate the temple's destruction. So we have synagogues that are 300 years older than they exist 300 years before the temple. Okay, so
Okay.
there was a service going on. Religious texts were being read before the temple was destroyed. So again, the rabbis institutionalizing these things, a lot of it happened after the temple was destroyed, but they didn't write the Amidah after the temple was destroyed. After the temple was destroyed, though, they said, we're going to do it every time we did a sacrifice. So it existed, and then they said, do you understand? And now they said, and since we have this wonderful prayer, it kind of has the purpose of what the sacrifices had, which is, well, when we get to the Amidah in a moment, literally get there in a moment, I'll show you. Well, we'll look at it and you'll see the rabbi said that's why we're going to do it, because the sacrifices we're supposed to do these things, and now we're going to do them because the Amidah has this. It's a perfect thing for it to take its place. So that the rabbis are the ones who said that this is where it goes, but it had already existed. Again, they wrote it. I mean, we know we the Talmud talks about how they edited it. The Amidah, they edited it. They know that the Amidah itself, there was an accretion of texts over time in the Amidah, but by the Roman period, by the Greco-Roman period, they said, okay, these are the prayers that are part of the Amidah, and they talk about that. That's in the Talmud. The discussion of what's going in there is there. The discussion of when to say the Shema is in the Mishnah. The Mishnah was started before the temple was destroyed. So the Mishnah actually begins with that. It begins with this discussion of when time we say the Shema.
And when did bar mitzvahs start happening?
When did bar mitzvahs start happening? It's a good question because we don't know exactly, but during this period of the early rabbinic period too. So about 2,000 years ago. We don't have a lot of testament to it except in the Mishnah, which again, the Mishnah was finished in 200 of the Common Eras. We know that it's definitely there, but how much before? How old are the texts that talk about bar mitzvah? That's difficult to assess for sure. However, I think, and we can look it up, it's true. One of the earliest texts that we have that affirm that bar mitzvahs were in existence before the temple was destroyed is in the Christian Bible. Because the Christian Bible talks about how Jesus came to the temple when he was 12 years old. And now it's in the book of Luke, which is the least of the Jewish gospels. Interestingly, Matthew and Mark, those gospels don't have it in it. They don't have that story, but Luke does. The Luke story is a little strange because it's a little off in the sense that it says that he was 12. Okay, so maybe he was advanced, but it seems like Luke is not quite sure that it's 13, but it doesn't matter. And he also basically says that Jesus didn't come to the temple to read the Torah or to learn Torah, but he came to teach the Torah. So the story is really a story of speaking about how Jesus turned his bar mitzvah into a lesson where he already started to teach the people. But what's interesting about it is whatever you want to say about the story, about why it's there and how it developed and what's missing from it and why it's not quite accurate, doesn't matter. It's there, which means that the people in Jesus's time were doing a bar mitzvah. Luke referred to it because everyone knows that Jewish kids at 12 or 13 or somewhere around that age do something like this. So it's one of the earliest texts because, again, the Mishnah we know was finished within 100 years of that. But it says if Jesus was alive and doing that in the temple, we know. And again, we know that it existed around that time. But how early? Again, so can't know for sure. But I do think that's one of the reasons why, again, reading the Christian Bible is important for Jews because these stories are there and they tell us a little bit, they give us a little little stories about our own history. So, anyways, some people would say that's not a big deal, but I think it's pretty cool. Um, by the way, according to the story in Luke, Jesus' parents left him behind in Jerusalem. They didn't realize that he wasn't there when they started walking back. When I told my dad that story, he said, "That's no Jewish parent left their kid behind." And so I said, "Well, Luke wasn't the most Jewish of the gospel writers, so he might have embellished that part." But yes, it seems pretty strange. It's kind of a Home Alone version. Yes, it's a early Home Alone where Jesus got left behind. But again, the point was is he was teaching people. Yeah, Esther. Hmm. So that's a good question. So Esther just said, why do we do weddings on Thursday evenings? It's not just Thursday evenings. It could be a Tuesday evening. It could be a Wednesday evening. Jewish weddings do not have to be done, never had to be done on the weekend. And actually, yeah, very rarely would they be done on Saturday nights. The whole concept of doing one on a Saturday night is already, even after Shabbos, is a little bit of a stretch. It's not something that people do in the Orthodox world at all because they can't prepare for it. They can't cook for it. They can't do anything on Shabbat. So weddings in the Orthodox world won't be done. The whole concept of doing a wedding on a weekend for us is as for Jews is a new concept. So weddings would always be done midweek. You could say, well, we do it on weekends so people can travel for sure. I mean, nowadays, how often does all your family live in the area? So doing it on a weekend obviously allows people to come in, spend a couple days. I mean, that's one of the main reasons we do it on a weekend. But we also do it on weekends because, you know, there was a time, and you can see it in Fiddler on the Roof, where everyone in the shtetl came out for the wedding, right? Everyone was there. So if somebody was late to get to work the next day, no one asked, "Where were you?" Everybody knew. Everybody came in late that day because everybody in the shtetl woke up a little bit later after a wedding. You can't do that today. You can't. I mean, you can. You show up at work, hungover on Wednesday. People say, "What are you talking about? You went to a wedding last night?" So yeah, I mean, I guess you take the day off, but yeah, we that's why we do them on weekends. There's no reason for it other than our modern life. It was not intended to be what Jewish weddings were not intended to be. And maybe we'll talk about that more when we talk about Jewish life cycle and Jewish weddings. That yeah, Jewish weddings were never fixed to be on the weekends ever. So let's take a look at the service itself and the organization of it and how it comes to be. Um, but we're going to start with the morning service because, as you can see, and this is the whole thing right here, this is the longest of the services. All those things that you see on the right, on the left column in the yellow, I made it yellow for the day, is longer because you can see there's sections that we don't do in the afternoon or the evening. So those services are shorter, considerably shorter. Not only because we don't do the Torah service during the afternoon and evening, but because there's a whole lot of stuff that we do as we wake up that we don't do in other services. So we begin with what we call the Birchot HaShachar, the morning blessings of thanks. These are kind of our warm-up blessings. These are the blessings that help us get stretched. And I've even seen some of the Birchot HaShachar. Some synagogues kind of put that to yoga or stretching moves because we talk about in those prayers. We thank God for helping us stand in the morning, helping us open our eyes. Giving us the strength to continue on. All of those things in the Birchot HaShachar, and they're blessings that help us, kind of get into a feeling of gratitude and just a feeling like, oh, we can start our day. I mean, one of the first blessings that we've talked about before. It's in the morning service because it's in the Siddur now, but it was meant to be said at home. Was the blessing that you say after going through your bodily functions for the first time of the day, because that was an affirmation that your body was functioning, it was working. And so the traditional blessing of Asher Yatzar, that the fact that a person's body works, was part of the morning blessings, and it's now been included in the service. But originally, it was just said by everybody when they went to the bathroom for the first time. And so the Birchot HaShachar really kind of gets us stretched out. It helps us wake up, and we then go into Pesukei de Zimra, which are psalms that we say in the morning. And the psalms are psalms that, for the most part, are a testament to, again, starting our day, being grateful. And the psalms change a little bit because one of the Pesukei de Zimra, one of the psalms that we do every day, is a different psalm depending on the day. So Thursday has a psalm, Friday has a psalm, Saturday has a psalm. So as we go through the week, each day we do a different psalm, and then of course the daily psalms that we always do. Those morning psalms also change a little bit for the holidays. And so, for example, when we come to the time of high holidays, we add to the morning psalms, we do Psalm 27, which is a psalm of repentance. And so we do morning stretches, if you will, which also include these psalms, and these are kind of our wake up time. And then we go into this section which is in green, which is that we call the blessings of the Shema. There are two blessings on the front of it, which are in the morning a prayer Yotzer Or. And so we begin with the Baruch Hu, call to worship, Baruch Hu Adonai and Barah, and then we finish that part with a Yotzer Or prayer, a prayer over the Or, over the light, over a dawn. And so this is a prayer over creation, over light, over to some extent then everything else that follows after it. In the morning, that's followed by a prayer called Ahava Rabbah, which is a prayer of love, but love expressed as we would understand it as Jews through the Torah. And so it's love that's expressed through the revelation of Torah, through knowledge, through connection with God, that is expressed by God's love for us through a system that helps keep us alive, through the Torah. And so we have the Ahava Rabbah prayer, which again, Ahava means love, and Rabbah means much, great, lots of love that God has for us, which then puts us into the frame of mind for the Shema, which we call it the affirmation of our faith, the watchword of our faith. You hear different people say different things, different ways of calling it. The prayer that is the motto is the testament to the oneness of God, to the unity of God. But the Shema is supposed to be said in the morning and in the evening. And so it comes directly from the Torah. The other prayers before and after it, the Yotzer Or and the Ahava Rabbah, don't come from the Torah. They're not Torah texts, but the Shema is. And if you will, it's kind of adorned by these texts that come around it, the prayers that come around it. So the Shema talks about God's oneness, but of course it also talks about our love for God. To love God, as we say in the Ve'ahavta, to love God with our heart, with our mind, with our soul, with our energy. And so it's a reflection back of God's love for us in the Shema. And at that point, we went from creation and revelation to the Shema. So we think about God's creating these wonderful things for us, this wonderful universe, God's love that's expressed through the Torah that helps us kind of live in this world, and then the Shema, and then on the other side of it is a prayer for redemption. So we have creation, revelation, and then we have redemption. In the morning, it's the prayer that has as its base the Micha Mocha, the song of redemption, the song of the sea, the song we sang when we became free. And it ends with the prayer, Baruch atah Adonai Ga'al Yisrael. Thank you, God, for redeeming us, for redeeming Israel. And so the prayer of redemption is the way that the Shema and its blessings end, with a sense of being redeemed. And that section, the Shema and its blessings, is a very old part of the Siddur. It's part of our worship. And then it kind of exists as a unit. Because when we think about the Shema, we think about the blessings we say before it, the Shema, and the blessings after. And then traditionally, we would then go into the Hatzi Kaddish, this affirmation of basically saying how wonderful God is, that God is beyond prayers. But the purpose of the Hatzi Kaddish was to separate the Shema and its blessings with the Amidah that followed it. It was kind of the moose bouche between the Shema and the Amidah, because we recognize that they're both really important, but they needed some kind of transition between them. And so that's what the Hatzi Kaddish was. It's not really a prayer in itself, in the sense that it's called a doxology. It's a statement of faith. It's not really a prayer. It's not really asking God for anything. It's not thanking God for anything. It's just praising God. But we felt that that's a great way of transitioning ourselves into this next part, the Amidah. And the Hatzi Kaddish really does that too. And in a traditional service, the Hatzi Kaddish is said a few times as a transition, as a way of kind of marking the chapter and then saying we're beginning this next chapter. So it's a transition. So then we get to the Amidah. And the Amidah is really the heart of the Siddur. How do we know that? Well, because it's super long, especially during the week. Now, we don't see that because, again, we generally come on Shabbat and on the holidays when the Amidah is much shorter. So let's just mention this, talk about this just for a minute or two. So again, it's called the Shemona Esrei. It's called the 18 when there's really 19 blessings. But of the weekday prayers, and again, this would be for the morning, the afternoon, and the evening, 12 of those prayers are prayers asking God for things, what we call petitionary prayers. God, please help me be successful. Please protect me from my enemies. I mean, some of these things you could say are, just standard normal things that people would ask for. But there's this understanding that on Shabbat, we don't ask God for things, so we don't do these petitionary prayers. The Amidah begins with the Avot, the Imaot, or now we say the Imaot, the mothers, our fathers and mothers, and then goes into a prayer called the Gevurot, which is the part that ends Mechaye HaMeitim or Mechaye HaKol. We thank God for the wonderful strength that we get. God gave us. It's praise. God is the source of this strength. These are prayers that are praising God. God of our ancestors, and God who gives great strength. But then again, during the week, we said that those prayers are then added. We have this whole section of petitioner prayers, of asking God for things. And then we finished with those prayers with prayers of gratitude. And the very last prayer is a prayer for peace. Rikat HaShalom, which is Oseh Shalom. Those prayers, the prayers at the beginning and the prayers at the end, are always part of the Amidah. It's the prayers in the middle that drop out on Shabbat. And on Shabbat and on holidays, instead we insert a couple of prayers that are about the holiness, the sanctity of the day. So on Shabbat, it's Mekadesh HaShabbat. Thank you, God, for giving us the holy Shabbat. And on the holidays, it becomes whatever the holiday is. Thank you, God, for the remembering of the covenant that we do at Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. So the prayers are on Shabbat, basically take out the petitionary prayers and put in recognition of the special day. But Um, it's a very important part of our service. And as you can see, it's really the only part of the service that we do morning, afternoon, and evening. Because in the afternoon service, we don't do the Shema. The Shema we do in the morning and the evening because the Torah tells us you say these words when you lie down and when you rise up. It doesn't say you do it in the afternoon. Look, there's nothing wrong with you doing it, the Shema in the afternoon, but it's not part of this, not part of the liturgy. The reason that the Amidah is there is because that's where the sacrifice, where the Mincha afternoon sacrifice was. Nope. Nope, these are not the same. So Esther said, were these the words? No, they weren't. But the Amidah took the place of that korban, the sacrifice. The the sacrifice was so important because it did these things. It praised. They were sacrifices of praising God. They were sacrifices of asking God for forgiveness. They were sacrifices asking God for peace. All of those things are in the Amidah. And so the rabbi said, the Amidah is going to take the place of the sacrifices because that's what the Amidah does. It does what the sacrifices did. So, okay, so yes, the we don't know exactly what happened, what the brachot or the blessings or what exactly the Kohanim, the priests said when they did, but when they came to the peace offering, they would say, and now we're offering the peace offering. We don't know the formula that they used, but there's no reason to imagine that they're in the prayer, the form of the prayers that we have in the Amidah. So because the priests would offer up every time they offered up a sacrifice, they were offering up sacrifices for the asham, for the sin offering. They'd offer up a shleimim sacrifice for peace. They'd offer up a sacrifice that was the morning sacrifice because that's what the Torah says. You offer up a morning sacrifice. Look, the Torah commands us to sacrifice. I mean, all over the place. The whole book of Leviticus, the whole book is about sacrifices. And so for the Jewish people to move from sacrifices to this, again, it wasn't overnight because the prayers existed. But once the temple was destroyed and the rabbi said, that Amidah that we have, that's going to take the place. That's a revolutionary idea. That's an idea where you go, oh, wow, that's audacious. But they had a reason for it because they said, this is the perfect prayer because it has all the elements that the sacrifices had. And because they're not going to say it because they can't. In their minds, probably, because they're not, for the most part, priests, the rabbis, they're the Sadducees are the priests. They're the other party. My guess is they thought theirs was better. Because look, I mean, there were beautiful poems and there were 19 of them. Well, there's not 19 different reasons to offer sacrifices. There's like 7 or 8, but they must have thought that their stuff was really good. And again, thankfully they did because we still have it. And we figured out a way to continue to pray to God after our temple was destroyed. Because there were a lot of people who said, we can't pray to God if we don't have a temple. And the rabbi said, no, of course we do. We've been doing it for a long time. We're just going to keep doing it. And now we have a reason to do these prayers, especially a prayer like the Amidah. They didn't have to make an argument for doing the Shema because you're supposed to, the Torah says you say it in the morning and the evening. But this idea of, again, what takes the place of a sacrifice? The Amidah. So if you speak to someone who's religious, if you speak to an Orthodox Jew, they all know this. They all know that the Amidah has taken the place of the sacrifices. We don't really talk about the fact that we have sacrifices, so we don't focus that much on it. And I don't mean that every Orthodox Jew wants to see the sacrifices come back, but they will tell you that as long as we do the Amidah, that's taking its place. That's the placeholder. So again, in the morning, the Amidah, we'd finish the Amidah with Osei Shalom, and then we would go into, by the way, in Orthodox synagogues, they do this, another Chatzi Kaddish, and then they would do the Torah service. So if it's not a Monday or a Thursday, you go into the Aleinu. And the Aleinu is a prayer that you can see that we do morning, afternoon, and evening. So in the afternoon, well, I don't want. I'll do the afternoon in a second. The Aleinu is a prayer that existed by the Middle Ages, or by the end of the rabbinic period. It's old, but it is not necessarily connected to the sacrifices, but it really kind of caps off the service. And the theory, of course, is that it really ended the service because it was a prayer that spoke about the past, the present, and the future. And it kind of wrapped up nicely what it is that we're doing. And it contains lines from the Torah, from the prophets. And it is a prayer that kind of affirms that what we're doing is what God wants and is going to bring about the oneness and eventually the unification of the world and the unification of God. In that day, the prayer, the Aleinu finishes, V'ne'emar v'hai Adonai al kol haaretz, that God will be the ruler of the entire world. Al kol haaretz. Doesn't say for Israel, for everyone. And so this is kind of a messianic, utopian vision of the world. I'm going to say this now because I might forget it later. when when other movements dealt with this Aleinu prayer, they weren't comfortable with the language of it initially, I would say, like in the 50s and 60s. And so synagogues, some of them consciously changed the words of the Aleinu. They didn't like the words because to some people, the prayer sounded chauvinistic, that we were saying we were better than everyone else. Because the prayer literally says that God chose us. Now, it doesn't say that God didn't choose other people, but it's an affirmation of the chosenness of the Jewish people. So some people didn't like it. And so they changed it. They didn't do away with the Aleinu, but they changed the language of it. So in our Reform prayer book, the one that we have, they have different versions of it. They have the traditional version of it, and then they have the more inclusionary, I would say, in the sense that it's not the chosen version. So here's the problem text with it. And I'm only getting into this. I want to talk about this at the end, which is the different versions of the prayers. So I guess you could say there would be no issue. Well, you decide. I'm going to decide for you. The line that some of the Jewish thinkers in the 50s thought about. This was not in the 80s and 90s. I don't say this was like this woke agenda of the last 20 years. I don't want everybody to like. No, this was discussed in the 50s. The line of Aleinu says, "Shalo asanu kegoye haratzot," that God did not make us like the other nations, goye haratzot, the other nations of the world. Now, you can understand that as a chauvinistic statement. Some people did, and so we got to get rid of that. And they put a positive way of kind of like phrasing it so that the syllables would be the same. So instead of saying Shalo asanu kegara tzot, they would say Shakaravtanu le Shem Hashal. Basically, the Reconstructionist version of it is that you've brought us closer to your name, which isn't anything about chosenness, but you've drawn us close to you, which is a nice way of saying you've made us close to you, but not at the expense of anybody else. So some people felt uncomfortable with the Aleinu, but we understood that this was an affirmation of our unique history. I think it's a really beautiful prayer. I think it's a testament. It's one of my favorite prayers because I think it's a testament to the fact that what we're doing is unique. And if we don't believe it's unique, then why bother? Why bother doing anything that's in this moment unless we thought, hey, this is special? Again, I don't believe that means it has to be the expense of other people, but the fact that it's unique and that it's traditional and that it goes back thousands of years and that, that we believe that it'll be going on for thousands more years, I think is a wonderful idea. And I think that's part of what makes the Alenu special for me. So I it's an old, very old, as I said, it's a very old prayer. It's a 2,000-year-old prayer. And it is, I think, a prayer that speaks to the past, the present, and the future. But it's also one of those prayers that people have had issue with. So there's a lot about Alenu. But the Mourner's Kaddish was always part of the service. Placing it at the end of the service is a little bit more of a modern, um, by modern, I mean like the last 400 or 500 years. But doing a version of the Kaddish, which again is very similar to the Chatzi Kaddish. There's also a Kaddish Shalem, which is called the full Kaddish or the complete Kaddish, because there's another line, one line that's in the Kaddish Shalem that's not in the mourner's Kaddish. The shortest one is the Chatzi Kaddish, which means the half Kaddish, but it's really like just not half; it's three-quarters of the Kaddish. But it doesn't have the Osei Shalom, it doesn't have the Yehei Shalom Araba lines. But the Kaddish prayer, of the idea of doing it at the end, was kind of this understanding that if we do it at the end, first of all, everyone will be there. And so everybody who wants to say Kaddish for somebody will be able to be there for them. But it also kind of reminds us that if we're if we've gone through the service and we've gone through the flow of the service, as we come to this end of the service, as we finish the service, there's kind of an affirmation too now of the cycle of life. But we don't want to end that way. We don't want to end on feeling like we've just dealt with loss without then coming back with a closing song. And synagogues instituted different traditions for this. Some had Adon Olam, some had Ein Eloheinu, some had Yigdal. These were all songs that started developing in the Middle Ages. Some of them in the later Middle Ages, some in the 15 and 1600s. But these hymns, these piyutim, these songs, kind of allowed people to go out from the service on a feeling, that you're in a positive way, and you're going to be feeling good as you come out of worship, and with a prayer that's, again, the songs are all praises of God. They're not asking for things. They're just talking about how, Adon Olam. We're talking about how wonderful the universe is. That there's no end to it. There's no end to God. Um, there's only one God, Behu Echad Ve'ein Sheni, which is there's only one God. There's no second, which is not just an affirmation of God's unity, but also kind of don't talk about another God. Um, but this idea that we're all part of this is, I don't know, you can't. Yeah, you can't. But look, the idea of
You
calling
can't
it
what?
service is an old idea. It's called avodah in Hebrew. Prayer in Hebrew is called tefillah, but we actually call what we do in a synagogue, and what the rabbis used, the same term that they had used for the temple for the sacrifices, is avodah, which means work or service. So the word to serve or to work was part of what we were doing. So it's spiritual work, it's work of the spirit, but there was an understanding that yes, you have to put something into it. There has to be some effort put into the prayer, just like there was effort that was put into the sacrifice. I mean, calling it avodah is obvious. They had to bring up a bull and they had to slaughter it and they had to burn it. That's a lot of work, but it was considered spiritual work. And the one thing that we also know about the spiritual work, and there's people who've argued about this today of the reincorporation into this, but it's not going to, I don't want to dwell on it because I don't think it's going to change anytime soon, and I don't know that it needs to. The rabbis discuss in the Talmud in the early times when they're talking about prayer that the rabbis were bowing and they were going down, as we mentioned this before, into a full prostration. They were lying all the way down on the ground. And they were bowing and they were using their bodies and they were worshiping with their bodies. Now, some people have said we need to do this again and that Jews shouldn't feel uncomfortable doing this because that's what we used to do. Now, we've talked about this. The Jewish people stopped doing it because Muslims and Christians, and Christians first, and then Muslims did the same thing. It's weird because I don't think that the Jews were the only person doing this 2,000 years ago, before there were Christians and before there were Muslims. I don't think the Jews were the only people that were using their body for prayer. But somehow, once these other monotheistic religions that came out of Judaism were doing it, then it made Jews feel uncomfortable, which is weird because you didn't feel uncomfortable when Canaanites were doing it or whatever else, when probably you borrowed it from other people. But once people were borrowing it from us, then we're like, we're not doing that anymore. But, I get it because people do that all the time. They see something that somebody wants, right? And they get it, really want that car. That person has it and they're very rich and they're very successful. And once I get that car, I'm going to be that. And once the guy down the street gets the same car, you're like, I don't want this car anymore. He's got that car. And I think that's what happened to some extent with the way we prayed. So once people were doing it from us, then we're like, no, that's crazy. But they did. And if they look, the rabbis describe it in the Talmud that there was so much physical exertion done on this that they would say that this rabbi started on one side of the building and he wound up on the other side of the building because of his prayer movements. I mean, that tells us that, again, maybe he's not the normal guy, but people were doing that. And you see people when they daven that they're using their bodies, because we recognize, of course, that our bodies are important to our prayers. They're important to our thoughts and to our words. And so, moving while we were doing it, the Hasidim started saying, well, let's be realistic. Our bodies are meant to be in action when we do it. And there's some Hasidic groups that dance while they pray. They jump. There's the Karliner Hasidim literally jump while they're praying. And so there are people that have done that over the last few hundred years. And now there's people that are talking about incorporating, poses and different systems that people are using for stretching it from yoga, for example. So there's people that are talking about going back to that and trying to reincorporate that. I think it's difficult to do. It's not impossible to do. I also think that it's going to make for some interesting situations because I think people are going to really want to do that. But I think if, and it's not something we've done for a long time, one of the things that Reform and Conservative Judaism did is it really moved away from some of the Hasidic things like moving and bowing and moving around when you prayed. And so that was considered to be kind of like lower class. And so, Reform synagogues and conservative synagogues, some of them really did away with most forms of bowing and really kind of did not go crazy with the bowing, where you'd see very, very minimal amount of bowing when they did the prayers. But that was more, again, not because they wouldn't want to be Christian, but because they don't want to be like Hasidim that were davening like that. Davening was considered that's Orthodox, that's Hasidic, that's Eastern European stuff that we don't do that anymore. Because quite frankly, you went into a church, you didn't see people doing that. They bowed, and there were obviously, it was one of the things that differentiated Catholics from Protestants is that people would, Protestants would go to a Catholic church with one of their friends and they're like, they're bowing all the time. They're down on their knees, and they would make fun of it. But the Protestant churches had very little bowing. They'd have some standing and they'd have, some prayers that were said standing. But for the most part, people sat in the pews. And that's what they did. And they didn't jump around and they didn't dance. If they went to an ecstatic church, if they went to a Pentecostal church, that was their choice. And people thought it was crazy. I mean, most mainline Protestants, if Episcopalians and Methodists and stuff would see that stuff and they go, that those people are crazy. And I think the same thing happened in the Jewish world, which is like people saw Hasidim that were moving around and dancing and bobbing. They were like, craziness. Why are you doing that? So again, we've definitely separated ourselves from movement. I feel mixed about it because and I well, we're not quite done yet, but this is kind of what I want to talk about at the end, which is like, what do we do? But yeah, yeah, please. Yeah. So Mike just asked what certain prayers have to come in as fixed liturgy. It's in the Mishnah. So the Mishnah says, yeah, so the Mishnah says you have to say the Shema in the morning. You know, the the by the time the Talmud is finished, the Amidah is finished. And so the Amidah has to be done with these blessings. The Barhu, so the Shema and its blessings are also, yeah, they also are part of this. That's these ones that I put in green. Yeah, and so those are also in the by the time of the Talmud is finished, or right, or just after that. So these ones, pretty much everything that we see here, until we get through to the Alenu, and even like I said, the Mourner's Kaddish is. It's only a question of where we place it. Is all this is in all the prayer books. The Adon Olam and some of these other prayers, those are different. Those are newer. And this is also one of the things I was going to tell you. They're different in Sephardic or Ashkenazi. So there are differences. These parts will not be different. For the most part, very little variation, which means that by the time we have the development of Ashkenazi Judaism, which is about 1,000, and Sephardic Judaism, which is identifiable, in around the same time, around 1,000. I mean, look, you almost have to have both in order to. They were within a few. They were happening at the same time. So the idea that Jews in France and Germany, which is where the heart of Ashkenaz was in the Rhine Valley, when those Jews start doing their thing in their kind of unique way, the Jews in Spain and France, not far away, are doing their thing. And there's differences, but the prayers themselves are the same. And by the way, when Jews in Yemen are doing their things, but they're adding to around this section. They're not changing this section. They're adding around it. And so there'll be differences with the Pesukei de Zimra. There'll be differences at the end, but the heart of the prayer is the same, which means that it really didn't change until after the Jews left the heartland of Israel and Babylonia, after those destructions and after the Islamic period. Yeah. 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 Well, they those are more Mizrahi, and we call them Sephardic because they speak Hebrew.
Rabbi, what Mike asked?
Mike asked about Sephardic Jews that are outside of Spain, outside of the outside. So today we try. So for a long time, and I'm talking about like all throughout my childhood into the 80s, people just used to say there's Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews. They still do that, by the way. I'm going to say that it's not right because Sephardic Jews technically were Jews that came from Spain. Some of them were, when they were forced out of Spain, a huge portion went to North Africa, and there was a huge movement also to Turkey and to what would be Greece and Turkey today, Sephardic Jews. Again, many came to Holland, many came to England, and they were the first colonists that came to the United States, the Sephardic diaspora. The Ashkenazi diaspora started in France and Germany, and we'll talk about this when we look at these groups, and they moved east to Poland and to Russia, and to Ukraine, to those countries. Hungary, all those countries that were Ashkenazi influence. But the Jews that lived in Babylonia, in Iran, in Yemen, those were really Mizrahi Jews, and they were different from each other too. The Yemenite Jews were different from the Jews that lived in Iran. But those Mizrahi Jews, we sometimes would call them Sephardic Jews. They're their rituals are closer to the Sephardi rituals, but they're not Sephardic. It's a misnomer. You're right. A lot of the people who are from those places will call themselves Sephardic, but there are a lot of people from those countries who now say we're not Sephardic. We are Mizrahi. We're Eastern. We're the Jews who lived these eastern regions, and in India, in Iran, in Afghanistan, all these places, and we had our own traditions. And it's not right to call it Sephardic because it's not Sephardic. So there's much more of that. There's also been more of an there. It's a very small group, but the Romaniot Jews who lived in Italy, they call themselves, in Greece, they call themselves Romaniot. They're not Sephardic. They're not Ashkenazi. Romaniot, Romaniot. And there are people who are Romaniot. One of them actually is part Romaniot that we know is Marcia Davis. Her mom's Romaniot. They have their own synagogues. They have their own prayer books, which are similar to Sephardic prayer books, but also not Sephardic prayer books. And so they are the Romaniot. There's a Romaniot synagogue in New York, and there are several in Israel. But these communities had their own prayer books. They had their own rituals, and so those already existed by the Middle Ages, by the late Middle Ages, so by like the 1200s. So when we look at the things that were added over time, a lot of them, there was sharing that went on between the different Jewish communities. It's not like, they just said, oh, we won't do that because we're Sephardic. There were definitely prayers that existed, and people said, well, yeah, we like that prayer. We're going to do that too. In Israel today, for example, the synagogues that are Sephardic or a synagogue that's Ashkenazi, there definitely be differences, but people can go to both. They can go back and forth to others, but people generally feel comfortable with the people that they the community they grew up with the style that they have. Now, what's weird, of course, is that in Israel, almost all the services, whether they're Ashkenazi or Sephardic, whatever, will be in English. I mean, in Hebrew. In America, the services in most Ashkenazi synagogues today will be English and in Hebrew. And so when we think about, I just want to talk about one other thing. First of all, two things. One is I want you to see the differences during the time of day. So we kind of touched on it, but in the afternoon, there is no Shema and its blessings. There's the Amidah and the Leinu, and before it, in the place of the Psalms, we do a psalm, but it's the Ashrei. And so the Ashrei becomes really important because Ashrei will also be part of the Birchot HaShachar, the morning service. Excuse me, the Pesukei de Zimra. This actually should be here. I got to change that. It's one of the morning psalms. It also is used in the afternoon. So the Ashrei is part of the Mincha, and then we go to the Amidah, Aleinu Morris Kadosh. So it's a very quick service. This is a service that literally people do in 5 minutes. And this is why sometimes you'll see it where someone will just say, hey, can you come over here and daven mincha with us? I'll do this like if you're on an airplane or in the airport or wherever, you might be in New York, you could literally be walking down the street around lunchtime and someone says, hey, can you come in and daven mincha? We need a minyan. But the minyan will be there so that people can say the Mourner's Kaddish during the afternoon because it's one of the prayers that we do. And for someone who wants to say Mourner's Kaddish 3 times a day with a minyan, it's very important. So people will do that in New York. They'll find the local minyan because there's literally no place in New York that you can't be within 100 feet of okay, maybe 3 blocks of a synagogue that will have a place you can daven at. You can go in the afternoon and you can say Mourner's Kaddish. So the evening service, we don't have warm-up prayers. It kind of makes sense because we're pretty warmed up by then. We start with the Mariv Aravim, start with the Baruch Hu, the night prayer, which instead of saying the prayer over the light, we say, well, the morning prayer says light and darkness, but at night we just say darkness. The reason that, by the way, we say Yotzer Or V'rei Choshech, the theory is that we that prayer goes so far back to the Zoroastrian period, to the period 2,000 years ago, where Jews who are living under Zoroastrians didn't want to pray for light and darkness in two separate prayers because they said, hey, that sounds a little Zoroastrian. So they said, nope, we're not going to say in the morning God creates light. We're going to say God creates light and darkness because Zoroastrians believed there was a power of light and the power of darkness. They were dualists. Mari Varvim is only darkness, though. Well, the night sky. It's dark. It's that God brings on the night, but it also says that God brings on the day. In the full bracha, it's not just darkness, but it ends Mari Varavim. God brings on the night sky. In the nighttime, Ahava Rabbah becomes Ahavat Olam. It's about Ahava, it's about love, but it changes a little bit. But it's still the same idea, the same concept as the prayer of love. The Shema Ve'ahavta is the same. And in evening, the prayer for redemption changes. The Micha Mocha part is the same, but the other part that comes after it is a little different. So we say Malchutecha Ra'uvanecha, that God's reign is part of our redemption, and it also in the evening includes the Hashkivenu prayer, which is the prayer over peace in the evening, which is connected to redemption, but is also, I would say, another prayer for peace. This is another difference that I will share right now, as we've talked about from a functional standpoint, that some people don't just have an issue with God's being referred to as a he, but some people don't like the word melech or malkenu, which is why I put in the Machzor a long time ago, Avinu Malkenu, our father, our king. I've changed to our parent and our sovereign, which is not very poetic, but I get it. But some people don't like the word Malkenu, Melech, because it's king, our king. And so they don't even want to say that. Now, it's really hard because it's in every bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Are you going to change every time you say the melech? But why is this a functional difference? Because the Reform Prayer Book and several prayer books, or several people who work out of a Reform Prayer Book, have changed the words of Hashkivenu instead of Malkenu to Shomrenu. This is why Rick and Addie do Shomrenu instead of Malkenu. Interestingly, when we were with Joe Buchanan has a beautiful version of Hashkivenu that he's recorded. He switches back and forth. He does both. Exactly. Mary knew. He does both. He does Malkenu and Shomrenu. He does the traditional Malkenu, and he also does the more inclusive Shomrenu. So Malkenu means our king. Shomrenu means our guardian. I think, again, the Reform idea was less monarchical, less kingly, and more Shomrenu, more guardian, more protective. So understanding that that's where that comes from. And this is, again, getting into the last thing we want to talk about is what does it mean for today? But let's just finish up. Aleinu in the evening, the mourner's Kaddish, and then, of course, Adon Olam, Marin Keloheinu. Usually, again, some song of happiness and having people go out in a happy way. When we talk about the high holidays, and we already talked about the calendar, and we talked about high holidays, but I want to tell you that basically our services for high holidays take this same sections, these same prayers, and then add to them. So at Yom Kippur, we had our confessionary prayers, our vidui prayers, which are prayers asking for forgiveness, whether it's Ashamnu or whether it's Al Chet Shechatanu. All those prayers are added around the Amidah after we start the Amidah, and those are prayers that were added over time, but some of them go back to, again, this idea that the Yom Kippur was a time of making ourselves right with God. And so those prayers were added to that, but they're not, they're not most of the service. Most of the service on Yom Kippur evening is this. Most of the prayer on Yom Kippur morning is this. Most of it. Yes. It's a great point. I'm going to get to it in 1 second. Mary just asked about the Misha Baruch, about a prayer for healing. The other prayers for high holidays that are really well known, like the Unatana Tokef, we add that around the Amidah too. That's who shall live and who shall die. Now, according to tradition, the first reference we have to it is from the 1300s. Well, that's pretty old. That's 700 years. And it was written according to tradition because of persecutions, and specifically, it came out of one horrible experience of martyrdom where one of the rabbis was literally chopped to death, chopped apart because he upset the local bishop. The Natan Tokef prayer goes back 700 years. The Kol Nidre prayer, well, Avinu Malkeinu goes back. An early version of it is mentioned by in the Talmud that Rabbi Akiva had a couple verses of Avinu Malkeinu. We don't know what they are because it just says he said the Avinu Malkeinu and he had a couple of verses. And then we know by the prayer books that we have in the 800s that there's like 20 verses of Avinu Malkeinu. So those things added over time. We don't know exactly like when they were all written, but we know that some of them are referred to in 150. And then by 800, there's many verses, but we don't know like how long it took for them or when those ones were added and when those ones, we're not exactly sure because we don't have prayer books from every phase of this period. We have one from 850 and we had one, we have one from, well, actually that's about the earliest that we can actually look at and say, but when we hear rabbis talking about it, they're usually not quoting the whole prayer. And they didn't in the case of Rabbi Akiva and talking about Avinu Malkeinu. Just know that he said Avinu Malkeinu, a couple of verses that began with the Avinu Malkeinu. Okay. So there's no reason to think why would they make that up? I mean, they're writing it during the time that he's living or very soon after, and they're saying he has Avinu Malkeinu. He's saying Avinu Malkeinu. Kol Nidre, we know is already in the prayer book by the 1000s, by that period, by 1,000 years ago. It's already in the prayer book. And again, it wasn't necessarily even for high holidays. When people say, oh, we're going to say it for Yom Kippur, they were like, yeah, let's do it at Yom Kippur because we have this prayer and it really works for that, which is we're going to say everybody who's sinned can come and pray with us. Now, a lot of times people say it had to do with the Inquisition. It's older than the Inquisition. Could have been persecutions that were happening to Jews where they were forced to convert to Judaism or Islam well before Inquisition times, and it allowed people who had converted on the outside to still pray. So that tradition is it's very possible that happened, but it did exist a really long time ago already, the Kol Nidre, but the idea of doing it at Yom Kippur and making sure we did it at Yom Kippur, that goes back about 500 years. So these prayers were added and like defined in some cases over time, but they exist early on. The same thing kind of goes to Misha Berach. We have prayers of healing that go back obviously to the Torah. When Moses prays to God to heal Miriam, we know that's a prayer for healing. What's interesting is when people have written the newer versions of the prayer for healing, they've gone back to that, right? So when Todd Herzog wrote Elna, he went back to that prayer to write it. The Misha Berach prayer, as a formula, goes back to the Talmud. So it definitely goes back a long time. And praying for healing was something that people did all the time. All the time. They did it all the time. In the Talmudic period, in the rabbinic period, for sure. And that's one of the reasons why people did it during the Christian times. That's why people were doing it in Jesus' name, because the rabbis were doing it. Praying for people's healing, 100%. We know of in the Torah, you can make the argument, and by the Talmudic period, it's written. We know that the prayer is written. But where are we going to do it? And the rabbis start to say during this period, and definitely by the time we have our first Siddurim, we're going to do it when we open up the Torah. When we do the Torah service, that's when we're going to do it. So, when I was a kid, that was the only time you did it. Misha Berach was only done when you opened up the Torah. And I mean literally in front of the Torah. And you never even knew what they were doing. You'd go up And if you wanted to have the rabbi or the gabbai say the person's name, you whispered it to them and they would go, "Misha Baruch Avotenu," and they'd throw in the name. And that was it. You didn't know what they were saying. Sometimes they translated it. Sometimes they said, "Hey, we're praying for," but very rarely. Like if you knew who Pinchas ben Avram was, then you knew, oh, that's Paul. We're praying for Paul today. They didn't know. I didn't know. And then people started feeling more comfortable with doing it. And it was really, really, if you want to know the truth, it was the reform movement that started it, because the conservative movement started incorporating it after the reform movement started doing it. And it was really Debbie Friedman writing the Misha Baruch blessing then version that synagogues do, including a lot of conservative synagogues, that opened it up. Now, she was working at Reform synagogues, but she was also working at camp. Conservative Jews picked it up and they liked it. And then they started really thinking about, okay, well, let's not bury this anymore. Look, in all fairness, I don't remember, and I could be, I, I, I could be wrong about this, but I don't remember many Reform synagogues even doing a Misha Baruch until the Debbie Friedman version. So the conservative movement did it, but did it really fast and didn't really focus on it for a similar reason, which is they didn't believe and they didn't want people to be thinking that if I pray to God that someone's going to get healed, they're going to be healed. And by the way, this didn't just come from the fact that they had a theology that God doesn't bother with people who have little problems. It's not that theology. Okay, maybe it's a little bit, but it was also because during the 40s and 50s, there were a lot of Jews that were, I probably wanted to have prayers for healing and they didn't have them in the synagogue. And there were Jews that became Christian Scientists. And there were even Jews that were trying to do a version of Jewish science which again, it's kind of a weird phrase that they call it Christian Science, because it's not scientific. It's praying instead of going to doctors. And so Judaism really was really trying to be a rational, pragmatic, scientific religion where people who wanted to go to university and who wanted to be part of Western civilization could feel totally comfortable. That kind of stuff they thought was voodoo. I'm just telling you the fact. And the reform movement was even more that this is voodoo than the conservative movement. The conservative movement allowed it and had it, never did away with it, but definitely did not put it in a centerpiece of the service. Literally, like I said, blah, 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 and nothing in English. Sometimes, again, at the end of a service, they'd say, hey, we send out special prayers of healing, or we're thinking about these people who are sick. They would say, we just want to let they would let people know that these people were sick, but they didn't do it as part of a prayer. They did it more of, hey, just so you know, your friend's sick. It was that kind of thing. So it was weird that the way that it came back was Reform synagogues that were doing Debbie Friedman's melody first, and then other synagogues followed suit, and then everybody said, well, why are we not doing this? But gosh, I remember that's really not until the 80s. Because I remember that when I was a student in the 90s, even early 90s, when I started rabbinical school 30 something years ago, it was still not like it was not necessarily on everybody's radar. It was not on everybody's book. I know that for a fact because I remember having a discussion when I had my first student pulpit. I said to the rabbi who I replaced, who was very into Jewish healing, by the way. He actually became, unfortunately, he passed away a couple of years ago. Harris Raphael Goldstein, blessed memory. He was the head of the what it was called, the Bay Area Pacific, I can't remember, somewhere in San Francisco. It was a Bay Area Jewish Healing Collective, I think it was called, and he was the rabbi of it. He was the head of it, so he was very into healing and to prayers for healing. And I remember him saying, when I asked him, does your synagogue, is the synagogue that I'm now going to be leading services, do Misha Berach? He said, it's more important than the Shema. So what are you talking about? He says, people, they come for that. They don't come for Shema, they come for Misha Berach. So I remember hearing that. I'm going, oh, that's interesting. And again, I know he said it because it was very important to him, but it was also, then I'm starting to think, oh, well, this is what people are doing. But it was not a foregone conclusion that you did it. And the fact that you did it on Friday night, because there were a lot of synagogues that still were only doing a Misha Berach on Saturday morning when they opened up the Torah. So again, if a Friday night service, when I was a kid, if I went to a conservative synagogue, they never did a Misha Baruch at night ever. And again, if at the end of services, if they said these are the people who are sick, maybe they did that, but they never did it in the form of a prayer. So this is an example. These are examples of how services have changed, and that's really what I wanted to finish with tonight. Is that services have changed. They've gone back and forth on issues of language, whereas Reform synagogues used to almost be exclusively in English. A lot of Reform synagogues now have a very balanced mix of Hebrew and English. But it was a big issue within the Reform movement because the Reform movement said, why are we doing prayers in English, in Hebrew, when no one knows Hebrew? And it was a valid point. A valid point. Shouldn't we do prayers in languages that people actually speak? And so this was why the Reform movement, really moved towards English. And now they've moved back because people said, okay, I understand you want to know what's in the prayer, but there's got to be Hebrew. There's got to be continuity and connection to the tradition. And that's why we have people today that are writing prayers, especially someone like Debbie Friedman, but Joe Buchanan today, that are writing prayers in Hebrew and English. And Joe had to teach himself Hebrew as an adult in the last 10, 12 years of his life, which is really hard. But that's another issue. And again, when we talk about gender, we talk about different images of God. Those are issues that people have. The issue of chosenness, that some people felt uncomfortable with the Aleinu. These are issues that have all gone into considering what a service, what a celebration looks like because of the language. And again, now I would say one of the biggest issues has been the length of it. And I think that's always been an issue, the length of the service. And I think that's always been an issue. I think people have been talking about that for a long time, whether people went to a synagogue 1,000 years ago, I bet you, where they said that service is really long or that service is too short. People had these arguments probably since the beginning of time, probably when there were priests in the temple in Jerusalem. That priest goes way too long. He needs to get to the sacrifice. Start cutting, stop talking. So they probably did that 3,000 years ago. But it's become an issue that we are more open to discuss today. And it's one of the things that I think became I guess it's become an issue because number one, we know that people have shorter attention spans today. That's partly because of the media and partly because of, again, the formats of media that we have today. But I think it accelerated, obviously, with the discussion. Yes, it also went through the discussion of how to come back from COVID and whether synagogues could go back to having the same length of services that they had before. People were like, nah, we don't need that. Because the reality is during COVID, services got shorter because there weren't people there. Did it online. They just went through the service. They maybe cut things out that they had never done. But there were a lot of synagogues, especially conservative synagogues, that followed a traditional order that said when they came back, people did not want to have a 2-hour, 3-hour morning service. It's become a big issue post COVID. So all of these things are things that people talk about. In many synagogues, not every synagogue, but many synagogues have drastically cut stuff out. It was never even a question. However long it was, that's how long it was. And if there was a long Torah portion, too bad. Now, a lot of synagogues that were conservative synagogues that, for example, had always a minimum 7 aliyot. Some of them have 3 now. Some of them have 1. So people have really reevaluated what people would be comfortable with because they just couldn't get people back in with that same kind of length. High holidays have gone down much shorter. And the reason that I felt we had to take this into consideration was that we, you you can't just say today this is the way it is and take it or leave it, because people can go online and watch it whatever service they want, and they are. There's tens of thousands of people that are going on every week to watch Central Synagogue service. I mean, I don't get it. I mean, I think it's nice and everything, but I don't know why it's become the service that everybody watches. But people, are driven by whatever popular things there are now. It's great, whatever. It's wonderful that people are watching a service, any kind of service, but they can. And because they can go to any service and they can do it anywhere they want from the comfort of their own home, you can't say this anymore. So, look, I don't know what the future will hold for service or celebration, but I definitely want people when they come to synagogue that the music is the driving force in worship. It always has been. It's gone through iterations and it's gone through sputters of it's not, but we know that it was under there the whole time. And so whatever musical traditions people had, whether it was doing a choir, a more Christian style choir, or whether it was having more folk music style stuff like Debbie Friedman. Look, our services are always reflective of the civilization, the culture, the people who are around us. And that's going to keep being the case. And we'll see what happens. But I want you to know, I just had lunch today with my friend John Shaver. It's the same thing that's going on in churches right now. He doesn't. But he was at church the other day, and his daughter says you were looking at your phone during services. Well, he's never done that before. So, so he said he's doing. He said he's doing what he told his daughter. He says, "I'm doing what everyone else does at services." So, unfortunately, that's part of the reality that we have today too. I probably shouldn't have said that, but the fact is if I was on the other side, maybe I would too. But yeah, I never even used to bring my phone into synagogue. I never did. I do now just to make sure that we're on YouTube, making sure that we're streaming, because I
had to check the Dodgers.
That I didn't do to check the Dodgers. I didn't actually. I asked. I think Mike. I asked Mike, or I asked Jeff. I asked Jeff Stein. I think Jeff's on right now. He'll confirm that he was the one who told me that the Dodgers had lost that one playoff game that they were losing. But yeah, or maybe I think it was the Friday night. Anyways, the fact it could have been a holiday even. It was even worse. But yeah, no, I never even brought this in. I never had this in the synagogue when I used to lead. But now, and I don't do it all the time actually, but I do want to make sure that it's on streaming. And now I occasionally use it because I don't have a clock up there as I look to see what time it is. And it's time for us to be done tonight too. So thank you, everybody. I wasn't sure we were going to fit this into one night, but we did. And some of these things are going to come up obviously in other discussions and some of the other classes that we have. But thank you, everybody, for being here tonight.
Hey, Rabbi.
Oh gosh, it was a lot. Yes.
Welcome back, Mike.
He's gone. He's already left. But your intention was well intended.
I've got a question from well, John and I are talking over each other. Let me get my question goes back about 15 minutes in this conversation.
Yes.
When you talked about the Jews, not the Ashkenazi or the Sephardic, the Jews in Italy. When I first started working, I worked with a fella who was Italian. The whole family had been Italian, and he described his parents from the old country who were Jewish as Galiziano.
Yeah, well, Galicianos are Ashkenazi. That's a subset because you raise a good point. Even Jews who are Ashkenazi were subdivided, right? So you had Galicianers, which were Southern European, that part of Eastern European Jews, mainly Ukraine, Hungary, Poland, those parts of southern Poland and Russia, down to the Black Sea area. Those were Galicianers. And in the north, those were people we call Litvaks. Litvaks, you heard that term before. Those were Lithuanian Jews. The differences between the Litvaks and the Galicianers were, number one, they spoke a different dialect of Yiddish, little difference in the way they spoke, but they also had a very different attitude with the prayers. The Galicianers were much, much more likely to be Hasidic. They were much more the knock on them where they were less educated and they were more earthy, I would say. They were the people that you see in Anatevka and in Fiddler on the Roof. And the Litvaks were more buttoned up. They were more educated, but they were also sometimes a little too uptight. And so that was the knock on the Litvaks, was that they were too uptight. So they did not necessarily like each other, by the way, very much. Litvaks and Galicianers would look down on each other and make fun of each other. We don't even understand that anymore because we don't even talk about that. But people who are Galicianers were again considered to be a little bit more rough around the edges, I guess you could say. My family were not surprisingly Galicianers, but we had Litvaks in our family too. So by the time they met in America, they didn't. It wasn't as big of an issue, but there definitely was a difference, and even within those communities, there were differences. So you had in New York, you had people that went to the Bialystok synagogue, which was just people from Bialystok. You had synagogues that were from, that were Odessan synagogues, where just people from Odessa would go to that shul. So even amongst the Galicianers, the Litvaks, there were differences. People would go to a synagogue, a Kovner synagogue, for people who were from Kovno in Lithuania. So yes, they would be buried.
What's the question?
As Esther's saying, they had their own societies, they had their own groups, and they had their own sections in the cemetery. Honestly, there were Jews who were buried in certain sections because they were part of that group, and so you'll see that. You'll see that in New York. You won't see it as much in America, in Western United States, the rest of America, because there weren't so many Jews, and so they didn't have that ability to fragment that way. But it was funny that you'll see that in America. You'll see synagogues that will have sections and stuff like that, but not very much anymore. And ours is coming, by the way. Ours is coming out. I hope in the next coming few days they'll have the Temple Beth Ami section for all of our mixes, and our people are from all over the world, including people who are not even Hebrew, who are not even Jews. Yes, we'll have that section open. All right, everybody. In the meantime, happy Hanukkah, because next time we're going to meet, it'll be Hanukkah, and that's
right.
we will meet
Thank
next
you.
week.
Same to you.
Monday. Thanks,
Take
Rabbi.
care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Happy Hanukkah.
Rabbi.
Bye.
Happy Hanukkah.
Bye, everybody. Happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah.
Happy
Bye.
Hanukkah.
Everybody.